Welcome to another video from Charis Ministries. We're glad you're able to join us today. Our passion is to see people trained, equipped and developing for ministry. You join us in part 2 of our theme of fasting, power fasting in the life of a believer. And in the first video we looked at the idea of what is our motivation for fasting, and being careful to look at the fact that it's not works, it's not us trying to earn God's favour or approval, but rather depending on His grace. So it's important we approach fasting with the right motivation. But I want to look at the second element of fasting today, and it says, how do we fast God's way? One of the classic scriptures on fasting is Isaiah 58, and God comes to His people and says, you're not fasting in the right way. You're certainly not fasting with the right motivation. And I would encourage you to read that passage for yourself. There's lots of promises that have to do with fasting in that scripture. And Jesus Himself says in Matthew chapter 6 that the Father will reward those who fast. So it's a worthwhile study. But what does it mean to fast in God's way? I want to take a few minutes to suggest 3 things to you today. Firstly, fasting is a way of humbling ourselves before God. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14 talks about, if my people will pray and humble themselves and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin and heal their land. In our video on community transformation, we looked at 4 elements of that verse. And we looked at the idea of praying, seeking God's face, of humbling ourselves. And fasting is a very useful way in which to do that. So we need to come to God with that sense of humility. David himself in Psalm 35, when his enemies were pursuing him, this is what he says, Psalm 35 verse 13. Yet when they were ill, I grieved for them. I even fasted and prayed for them. So here's David saying he's praying and he's fasting. And other versions talk about the fact that David humbled himself with fasting. So fasting has a great benefit, and fasting God's way allows us to humble ourselves before Him. Isaiah 57 verses 13 and 15 talks about God dwelling with those who are broken, who have a contrite heart. Jesus Himself talked about the poor in spirit. As we know, it's those who recognize their need of God, their dependency in God. It's not wringing our hands in shame or guilt or condemnation, but it's recognizing our need in God and humbling ourselves before Him. We looked at Philippians chapter 3 verse 3, which says that humility is about having no confidence in our human efforts. In other words, humility is placing our confidence fully in God. So the first thing, if we're going to fast God's way, is that we're humbling ourselves before Him. The second thing is that fasting God's way seeks God's will. If you do a study in Scripture, you will see that there are lots of reasons why we should be fasting. Fasting is a means of spiritual discipline. Paul talks about bringing his body into subjection. We're certainly living in the times that would be described as the last days. Another reason is to get free from sinful habits. So Paul talks in Ephesians chapter 4 verse 27 about those besetting sins, those repeated sins. Hebrews 12 talks about those as well. So the power of fasting is that it can set us free from those sins. Ezra chapter 8 verse 22 talks about fasting for our responsibilities and the burdens that we have. And in that particular passage, they're going back to rebuild their temple and they don't have a military escort. And Ezra says, I want to fast and pray for our possessions, for our little ones. What a great idea that we can fast and pray and seek God for our family, for our possessions, for our finances. These are the things of the daily bread that I think he's talking about. We can also see the oppressed go free. Isaiah 58 talks about the oppressed going free, loosing the bands of oppression. And Jesus talked about that's one of the things He came to do, setting the captives free. But there's also places like 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 8. Let me read it to you. And the children of Israel said to Samuel, "Don't stop crying unto the Lord our God for us, that he will save us out of the hands of the Philistines." So fasting is about humbling ourselves before God, but it's also seeking the will of God. And the promises that are mentioned in Isaiah 58, I would encourage you to look those up. Thank you for watching this short video. We hope it's been encouraging for you. Please watch our next video where we talk about 12 powerful prayers for fasting, things that can help you in your life, things that will encourage you to pray and seek God. Thanks for watching.